I am so excited to announce that I have released the first official Tarot Diagnosis spread book. Tarot and Self-Discovery is a therapeutic tarot journey with over 200 spreads, including over 152 card prompts and over 50 robust tarot spreads. You can purchase a physical copy on Amazon or a digital copy at thetarotdiagnosis.com. You are listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. Anytime the holidays roll around, I think about family dynamics. And it's usually because it ends up becoming this major focus in my clinical work with clients because we're usually just processing and practicing how to cope with all the difficult emotions that usually come with family gatherings, how to set boundaries, and how to communicate effectively with folks that maybe we've traditionally had difficulty communicating with. And then I think another influence for this episode has been the collection of essays that I've been reading called What My Mother and I Don't Talk About. And then I also just hosted a workshop inside the Tarot Diagnosis community, the symposium, on the Ancestral Shadow. But I think that there's something else about this season that feels really poignant and has me reflecting on, well, I'm usually often reflecting on this, and that's the concept of stories, because I feel like life is just a collection of stories, family stories, generational stories, personal stories, platonic stories, like stories, memories. And in addition to the stories that we tell and that we hold closely to us, there's also a collection of stories that don't get told. You know, these are the stories that we don't hear every year at the family gathering, you know, that we're kind of laughing about or kind of rolling our eyes saying, oh gosh, I've heard this story a million times before. It's also the stories that get tucked away, that we avoid, that our families avoid, that we want to keep hidden, or that maybe we never realized needed to be discovered. These are really similar to the shadows of our families. You know, these unspoken narratives or repressed narratives or rejected narratives that end up shaping us even when we haven't fully acknowledged them or even been able to acknowledge them because we weren't aware of them. And lately I've been thinking about how these stories actually connect to the suit of Pentacles. So I've been spending a lot of time with this suit, and I ended up laying the entire suit out and was really paying attention to what do all of these cards have in common, especially when it relates to family narratives and stories. And the Ten of Pentacles, of course, stood out the most because it is that generational card. But there's a few that I'm going to kind of talk about throughout this episode. I'm not going to talk about every single card because this episode would be way too long. But there's a few that I'm going to explore. So when I was thinking about the Ten of Pentacles, I realized our families are really the co-writers of our stories, especially our first stories. I mean, we can think about this through the lens of literal stories, you know, our family members, caregivers reading us, bedtime tales or something maybe not such a sweet memory, but maybe the kind of hushed warnings that we get when we're at family gatherings, you know, don't tell so-and-so that I told you this, or don't mention that thing because it's going to upset, you know, Uncle whoever. And it's these little interactions that create these family members being co-writers for our own stories, because they end up shaping or influencing the way that we behave, the things we share, the things we don't share, down to the ways that we're taught to celebrate or not celebrate or maintain composure, or worse, be silent. Family secrets and family stories impact us the same way that ancestral shadows do, and they can be very similar. So, and if you're a part of the Tarot Diagnosis community, the symposium, and you attended or watched the replay of the most recent workshop, you know that we explored this concept in depth. We worked to uncover ancestral shadows, name them, identify them, and then begin to figure out ways that we can work with them and even reprocess them. And these stories and shadows often can feel like ghosts or energy or like vibes, kind of like, when you walk into a house and you're like, or a gathering, you're like, ooh, there's something here. It's energy, or just the vibe is off, or the vibe is just different. You can feel something, but there's nothing there. And sometimes when you point out that feeling, people look at you like you're crazy because maybe they're not ready to address their own shadows, stories, or their own ghosts. And what's ironic is that the things that are left unspoken, the things that are not said, the stories that we don't share are often the ones that speak the loudest. Because these unspoken stories end up casting really long shadows. They're what shape us both consciously and unconsciously. And I think this is another kind of really important part of where the Ten of Pentacles comes back into focus. Because these stories, whether blatantly shared or kept hidden, end up becoming the legacies that we inherit. They travel with us. They move with us from one generation to the next, whether we realize it or not, or whether or not we are intentionally bringing them with us. Probably the most fascinating aspect of this whole concept is the fact that these stories and these shadows, the way I'm talking about them, it's not just metaphorical. It's actually biological and psychological, the ways in which we inherit these. So when I was talking about the ancestral shadow in the latest workshop, I explored how the concept of the shadow belongs to our family system. And it can originate as recently as our parents or further back, even beyond our great-great-grandparents. And this idea is really closely linked to the concept of generational trauma, which many of you are probably familiar with, or you might be more familiar with the terms ancestral trauma or intergenerational trauma. It's all the same thing. And this is basically emotional and psychological wounds that get passed down through families. And it typically is because of adverse experiences that family members have had that then shape their emotions, beliefs, and coping mechanisms, which then shape and influence the way that they interact with younger generations. Something else really interesting is this idea has been factually proven that these shadows or stories, for example, actually leave an imprint, not just emotionally and psychologically, but on our genes. So this is what I was talking about when I said there's a biological inheritance. There's a lot of studies out there that show this. There's a specific one in 2005, forgetting the actual title. It's something along the lines of transgenerational effects, specifically about post-traumatic stress disorder. And I really liked this study because it highlighted the importance of epigenetics. And everything that I'm talking about right now is also a concept or under the umbrella of epigenetics, which is essentially the science behind how these ancestral shadows and the idea of generational trauma impacts us today. And so this particular study found that there were biological changes in the children of individuals who had experienced trauma. So this means that the children did not experience the trauma, but their parents did. And yet the children still exhibited symptoms of trauma as if they had experienced it firsthand, even though they never did. Oh, so I'm a visual person. So the way that we can maybe look at this or think about this from a visual standpoint is the idea of nesting dolls. So we could think of ourselves as the outermost doll, and then inside, so that first doll inside of us would be, our parents. And then inside that doll would be our grandparents. Inside that doll, our great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. And so each of these dolls then represents an ancestor whose experiences, struggles, emotions, and the way that they interacted with subsequent generations have become kind of nested inside of us. And so then these emotional wounds and coping mechanisms and behavioral characteristics of one generation then become unconsciously inherited by the next. So I started thinking about how the Four of Pentacles kind of plays into this, because when I look at this card, I think of someone holding on so tightly out of fear. And I wonder, is this fear that they are experiencing something that truly belongs to them? Or is this an idea or a story that they saw played out or are experiencing because of interactions that they had with other people? And so this actually can be explained through a clinical example. So I shared this in the workshop. So I was working with someone who, and I use this example pretty frequently, who had a fear of fire. However, they had no experience with any sort of fire-related trauma. So then we started exploring and we're like, where is this coming from? And we realized that, their mom never allowed candles in the house because of her own fear of fire. And then we go a little bit further, keep digging, and we learn that the grandmother also showed a similar fear, kind of reacting with a lot of anxiety anytime, flames were present, with birthday candles or regular candles or even just cooking. So then and again, no sort of fire trauma so far with the mother or the grandmother. So then finally we trace it back to the great grandmother, who we then find out had survived a house fire as a child. So you can really see how over generations, that trauma started to evolve into some sort of unspoken family narrative rooted in fear and passed down not through direct experience, but through behaviors, messages, which led to this unconscious inheritance. So we can take this a little bit further and also apply it to the Eight of Pentacles, because I think the Eight of Pentacles can represent another ancestral shadow or a story that gets passed down through families related to the concept of hyper-independence. So hyper-independence usually happens when a child's emotional needs go unmet. And this is when the child is sharing stories about their own experiences and their own needs, and they are dismissed. And they're made to believe that them sharing themselves in this way is burdensome. So then over time, they start to develop narratives like, I'm too much, or I'm a burden, I shouldn't have needs, I shouldn't be sharing these parts of me. And I say that the Eight of Pentacles comes up for this because you see this person in the Eight of Pentacles working so diligently alone. And there's a lot of pentacles in this card. There's a lot of hard work. And it always makes me wonder, who is helping them? And are they even asking for help? And this is where it can get kind of interesting, because we need to be questioning ourselves. Is that hyper-independence, for example, or that fear of fire, or whatever story that you're experiencing, does it truly belong to you, or does it belong to an ancestor who maybe had to rely on that story as a means of survival? I think this really speaks to how much power both spoken and unspoken stories can have and hold over us, which then brings me to the experience of the Six of Pentacles. And this card always feels like there's some sort of inherent power differential. There's themes of an imbalance, but also this story of reciprocity. And we can apply this card specifically to power dynamics that are inherent in families. Who's giving, who's receiving, who's sharing stories, who's withholding stories, who's responding to your stories, how are they responding, who's kind of steering the ship, and who follows. The Six of Pentacles really asks us to evaluate a lot of these dynamics and understand how they're impacting us in our family system as it is now, and also how it impacts us in our relationships outside of our family system. I want to go back to the Eight of Pentacles again, because I feel like this particular card, especially as it relates to the concept of spoken and unspoken stories, has two roles. Not only is it a representation of hyperindependence, for example, but I also think that it reminds us that uncovering these stories is a lot of work. And sometimes it's work that we have to do on our own because other people aren't willing to go there. They don't have the coping mechanisms, or they don't have the foundation or the ability to. It's also important to remember that the process of looking at these stories isn't easy, and it is a lot of hard work because oftentimes its origin or even just looking at these narratives mean that we have to peel back layers of shame, pain, uncomfortable silence, fear, worry. And then inherent within that process is having to look at what's missing. How do we put this puzzle piece together? And sometimes we don't ever get that information. Sometimes the missing information stays missing. And I think the Eight of Pentacles comes in here to remind us that, yeah, not everything is going to fit perfectly together. This process isn't going to be, smooth sailing, but it's important to still approach it with curiosity and some level of persistence if you want to, break cycles or figure out how to exist and create your own narratives that aren't tied to ancestral shadows that might not belong to you. In one of the recent workshops, the Ancestral Shadow Workshop, I spoke about a really powerful session I had with someone who was working to explore an inherited story of emotional avoidance. And they were never able to truly uncover, how, why, or really where this began. They had some ideas and some ancestors that they were able to kind of tie, this particular story to. But they really took an Eight of Pentacles approach and kind of buckled down. And even though they didn't have all the information or all the pieces, and a lot of these family members had passed on, so they weren't even able to access them to engage in dialogue, but they were committed to almost like tirelessly work to own how these stories impacted them in their life up until this point. And we're really dedicated to figuring out ways to change it. And they came up with some really creative ways to connect with these stories, but yet create a degree of separation so that they didn't feel like they were absorbed by the stories anymore. And I think this is what it looks like to have a healthy embodiment of the Eight of Pentacles. It's understanding how these stories and these shadows can shape us, and yet being committed to work on some level of transformation in a sense, which that actually brings me to a really important concept when we are looking at spoken and unspoken stories, the stories that belong to us, the stories that don't. It's not about erasing stories or not even really necessarily about editing them. It's more about just acknowledging that they exist and figuring out what to do about it moving forward. This whole process can be about choosing the parts of, our ancestral narrative and our ancestral stories, for example, that we want to carry forward and which ones we want to release. And this is where, like I said, the previous session that I had, this person got really creative and created a bunch of rituals and ways to kind of set boundaries and explore and cultivate new beliefs and habits that align with the person that they wanted to become moving forward. And I think that's really fun and creative because this work and process in and of itself can feel really heavy sometimes and overwhelming. So having something that feels light and creative kind of lessens the heaviness that the stories can have. So to bring this back to the 10 of Pentacles, I think it's also important to remember that as we work to uncover these unspoken stories of our families or lineage, ancestors, acknowledging their influence and then consciously writing narratives that are true to us means that we're doing more than just healing. We're actually shaping our legacy. We're shaping future generations. And that requires a level of patience, a level of curiosity, and also a lot of compassion, not just for yourself, but your family. I thought exploring this was pretty pertinent given this time of year. Of course, it's the holidays. So I hope that if you're listening to this, before you gather with your family for the holidays, maybe you go in with a little bit more curiosity. What stories are not shared within our family? what stories are shared? What stories do I want to own? And which stories do I want to release and say that actually doesn't belong to me? This story belongs to somebody else. So why have I made it a part of my own narrative? And, or just hop into like your family gatherings and pay attention to the role that stories play. How are people sharing narratives? How are people engaging with each other? And in what ways has that impacted you throughout your lifespan thus far? I'm sure you'll uncover some interesting tidbits of information. So if this resonated with you, I think that you would probably love the Ancestral Shadow Workshop that we just had in the symposium. It was meaty and deep and so fun. I've been just kind of exploring it myself over the last month or so and plan on expanding my ancestral tarot tree. So if you were in the community, you kind of know what I'm referring to as the tarot tree. But I also want to invite you, those who maybe are not a part of the community yet. This community is such a fantastic safe space. There's monthly workshops that are so supportive that allow us to explore the types of themes that I talked about today more in depth. And we're able to blend tarot and psychology and connection with other people. And the Ancestral Shadows Workshop, which helped kind of influence this episode, has been probably one of the most powerful offerings. And it was so wild to uncover just my own stories that I've inherited and also be able to see how enlightening it was for other folks to reflect on some of their own stories that they've inherited and the impact that's had on them. So the recording for that workshop is available inside the community. So if you join now or later and obviously wouldn't have been able to attend live, you can always check the recording. And then there's always an in-depth workbook to follow along and complete at your own pace. So yeah, if that feels like something that you're ready to dive into and explore, I would love to see you inside the symposium. And also, I have, so for those of you who are listening, I have a special offer for you if you want to join the symposium. It's a Black Friday offering, but I'm not announcing this until actually Black Friday for folks who are, I don't know, on social media or on my email list. So this is just for you listeners. So I'm actually dropping the monthly fee for the symposium by 50% for the first 3 months. So you can really dive in and see if the community is something that will benefit you and a place that you want to explore yourself and deepen your tarot practice, over the next several months or even the next year. So if you visit thetarotdiagnosis.com and then click the symposium tab, you can use the code BLACKFRIDAY24 when you sign up. And again, I won't be announcing this to anyone else until actually Black Friday. So you all who are listening get a nice little perk before anybody else does. So I just appreciate you all again. And I hope that you take a moment to really be curious about your family stories and see how those play out and which ones truly belong to you versus which stories maybe belong to family members or ancestors that maybe you don't need to be holding on to anymore. So I'm holding lots of space for you all, and I hope to see you inside the Tarot Diagnosis community. Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, the Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.